Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to your Cybersecurity Series. My name is Vlad, and I'm here to help you engage in cybersecurity and discover more about this amazing field of expertise. Today, we continue our video series on Stuxnet, which is the name of the infamous and incredible campaign targeting Iran, and more specifically, their nuclear production facilities. So, we talked in the previous episode, in episode 12, we talked about how Iran was building its production capabilities through the years. We talked about how uranium 235, which is essentially the component used in the production of energy, how it's extracted from uranium 238, so an isotope, using those centrifuge systems. So basically, rotating the gas at very high speeds in order to separate the heavier elements, so uranium 238, from the uranium 235 that is so precious and that we want to collect. And by doing so in several centrifuges in series, we manage to enrich the uranium. And if we reach certain percentages, that could even be used as nuclear weapons. But that was all in the previous episodes. Today, we will focus on how the hackers managed to infiltrate the Natanz facility, so Natanz control room that you see here. How did they do it? Practical terms. So first of all, we need to remind what are the main difficulties of such an operation and why Stuxnet is such a brilliant idea and really one of those few attacks in the history of cybersecurity that really made the headlines and completely changed the perception of the world. So the first main, let's say, difficulty is that the facilities is completely offline. It's air gapped, meaning that it's not directly connected to the rest of internet. So attacking it already requires having a first foot within the plant, or at least finding a way to penetrate the systems. Second and third is that basically, as we discussed in the previous episodes, those centrifuges, they are not directly, let's say, driven or managed by a usual laptop, like a Windows laptop that you have at home. They are industrial control system, which we call SCADA systems or PLCs, which are there as an intermediary between the controller laptop and the rotating machines. And those industrial systems, they are a bit complex, first of all, and they also rely a lot on proprietary algorithms or proprietary protocols, which is the case, for example, of Siemens, which is the provider here in our example. And the configuration of those systems, which can be really diverse, because you need to understand that those PLCs, they can be used in nuclear facilities, but they can be used on production chains for automobiles, aircraft. You could even drive or manage components in oil production facilities. So they are really not, let's say, specific to an industry, but they allow you to make a lot of connections and capture information from the sensors, give orders to, for example, robotic arms, so you can control your entire plant or production facilities. But that configuration exactly was unknown because there were not many people allowed within Iran, or at least not close to the plant in Natanz, obviously, for confidential reasons. So you need to understand that from a hacking perspective, they had to find more information about what type of hardware or software was being used, what were the different configurations, what are the different flows or security mechanisms that they could exploit or circumvent. So there is a lot of information gathering before even launching the attack. And that's something that we will also insist on throughout this video. And finally, and that's the fourth and final difficulty that I would like to underline here, is that everything is monitored closely by the operators. So when conducting this attack at such a scale, because we are talking about attacking a vital systems of a country, which is heavily secured, even in terms of the facilities with guards, etc., access control, badges, background checks on the different employees, you need to understand that everything is closely monitored. So even if you manage somehow to hack a system, your attack needs to be stealthy enough in order not to be identified immediately. And that's really where the brilliancy lies in Stuxnet, and we will see how they exploited all of that. So first of all, again, a short reminder on what we discussed in episode 8. You need to know a bit more about the cyber kill chain. So these are the 7 steps that any cyber attack needs to go through. If you break down an attack scenario, you will always find those 7 items. So first, the reconnaissance, as I mentioned, harvesting information on the users, the system's configuration, all of that, all the interactions, how many centrifuges do they have, what are the rotation speeds, how do they manage them, maybe they do some sort of maintenance on the weekends. So understanding all of the business setup. Then we have step 2, the weaponization, which is essentially here building and or crafting a malware, so a computer virus that will be sufficiently compact in order to avoid detection, but also that will onboard a certain number of tools and techniques in order to infiltrate and execute some malicious actions. Step 3 is the delivery, and I will insist on that because, as we said, the plant is completely offline. So it's really different from the previous examples that we have seen in Carbon hack or in the hack of the French campaign in 2017. The idea is that you cannot just send emails because the plant again is not connected to internet, so they are not going to receive phishing emails on their web mail account. So this type of delivery is completely let's say out of the question in this scenario. So we need to be a bit more creative for the delivery. Then we have the exploitation, installation, meaning that the malware will install itself, will kind of deploy a certain number of tools. And finally, step number 6, which is also super interesting in this case, the command and control. Because most of the time you deploy a malware, but then you need to find a way to give it orders. Otherwise, the malware on its own cannot do much. But you need to have, let's say, someone driving it and say, well, it's time for the malware to damage a system, or it's time to propagate on a different one. And all those orders, how can you really send them if the plant is again disconnected? Which means that from a hacking philosophy, your malware needs to be almost entirely auto-sufficient so that when you deploy it once, you no longer have any access, you can no longer drive your malware. You just need to trust that the malware, which is the program, will do it the right actions as intended. So again, this is really to show you the level of sophistication, because as a hacker, you are basically blind. As soon as you find a way to put the malware in the infrastructure, you need to trust that everything that the malware will go through, all the systems that it will navigate, will produce the right results. That's the step 7, the right actions on objectives. So focusing on the step 3, which is the delivery, as you can imagine, one way is to target the weakest links. And here I would like just to show you a short clip from Mr. Robot, which is a famous TV show about hacking in general, and that follows the story of a hacker here played by the famous actor. So I will just do a short break and I will catch you back right after the video.
Shit. Connection closed by remote host. But we had a fish. I was in.
So I hope you enjoyed this short break. The idea, as you have seen here in the short clip, is that sometimes rather than focusing on the IT systems or the industrial systems, you want to target the weakest link, which is very often, unfortunately, the operator. So the human being who is actually managing or using the systems. And so targeting them can be done by, of course, social engineering. And we know that people, by default, they are quite curious. Everybody wants to know something. So if you drop USB keys on a parking lot, for example, as here in Mr. Robot, and you put like a tiny label on it with written confidential, the people will get curious, and some people want to plug the USB key to know what's so confidential about it. And so that's one way you can trick your opponents or your targets. And that was kind of the method that everybody thought that something like that happened on Stuxnet. We know since 2019 that there is a second version. So I'm going to be a bit cautious there. It's an alleged version. Apparently, there was a spy from the Netherlands who infiltrated the facilities. He was working for a fake company. He infiltrated the Iranian facilities and plugged the USB key, which was infected, or somehow managed to have another employee plug the infected USB key. So how did it go? Basically, the story starts with an infected USB key that is plugged into a terminal, just like in the clip I showed you. And then the malware, so Stuxnet, is going to propagate from the terminal into the SCADA server, so those industrial servers that are driving and giving orders. Then it's moving into the PLCs, which are those huge boxes looking like storage units. And those PLCs are the ones driving and sending the commands to the centrifuges, so the rotors, and all the rotating elements. What's quite interesting about this malware is that it was really infecting the PLC and changing all the information that was received and sent. So this malware could really send different instructions to the centrifuge and also share different information back to the laptop of the supervisor, meaning that the malware could on its own decide to perform some actions but not report it to the operators. So if you remember the difficulty number 4, which was that everything was closely monitored, by acting as what we say is a man in the middle, so you have like an intermediary, which is your malicious virus, you are modifying on the fly some instructions and some elements that are being reported. And that's really an attack on the integrity that we discussed. Basically, you are changing configurations, changing orders on the flight, so that even the operators back in the control room, they believe that everything is going fine. However, what's happening really is not matching the reports that you have in front of your eyes. And that's, again, a super clever way of infiltrating and a super way of conducting your attack in general. So I said that's the version 1. I didn't say it, but that was written on the slide. It's the version 1 of the hack, because actually there were multiple instances and multiple variants of the virus. So if we recap a bit the timeline, the story really begins in 2007. So around May, Iran was already building its capabilities. They had 1,700 centrifuges installed at Natanz, so the site that we are infiltrating. And so they were already enriching the gas, and they plan to, of course, ramp up their production facilities. What happened is that in September 2007, the first version of the malicious code was introduced and was, as I mentioned, propagated via an infected USB key. And this specific version of the virus was meant to close the exit valves. So if you remember, in those centrifuges, we introduce some uranium gas, and of course, we collect the enriched gas containing more uranium-235. And the idea was to close those exit valves. And of course, the gas would keep on accumulating and you would reach higher level of pressures. And that would, let's say in the long term, damage the centrifuge components. And of course, that's also a way that you can waste some materials or some gas, which nobody has in profusion. So you are kind of delaying and slowing down the entire enrichment process. And the story that everybody in cybersecurity has heard of is actually the second version of the virus. The second version was slightly different in terms of tactics. It was not about closing or opening the valves, it was about changing the speed of rotation. So in the previous episode, episode 12, I gave you the calculations. We know that the centrifuges were spinning at 3 times the speed of sound, so extremely fast. And what they were doing with that second version of the virus was really to change the rotation speed. So either increasing it above the acceptable thresholds or slowing it down immediately. And by changing very suddenly the rhythm of the centrifuge, it's going to break some of the components or damage some of the components in the long run. And what's interesting is that in between version 1 and version 2, it's not only about the actions that were being performed, that they changed their tactics about, it's really also the deployment mindset. So version 1 was relying on USB keys. But again, you either need to infiltrate physically the premises, or you need to have a spy on the ground, which is not that obvious. And it's not like every day you can infiltrate so easily such a complex and also military owned facility. So they changed a bit their tactic, and in the version 2, they were rather focusing on infecting subcontractors. So they were infecting the traditional laptops of the subcontractors. And when the subcontractor would arrive on site at Natanz and connect his PC to certain items or certain industrial systems, for example, to perform maintenance, then the malware, which was completely dormant, so completely, let's say, transparent for the user, would finally propagate. I understand that something was connected next to it and infiltrate the PLC or the industrial system, which again shows the level of preparation and understanding that the hackers had. Because this malware was really targeting the nuclear production facilities. So you had to meet a certain number of criteria. So if you manage by luck to infect, for example, an employee workstation, the malware will check, okay, am I running Windows 7, for example, or Windows XP? If I have the right version of Windows, then do I see that I am connected to an industrial system? And this system has to be Siemens, because they knew from the spying agencies that Natanz was relying on Siemens systems with a certain version. If it's not Siemens, then maybe I am not in the right facility, or maybe I am not even in Iran, so I'm not going to launch my actions. So I need to catch the right Siemens systems, and I also need to catch the right dashboard, so the right software that was driving the different industrial components. And fourth, they were looking for specific packets, so specific messages exchanged in between the centrifuge and the PLCs. And the idea, as I told you, is that those PLCs, they can be used in nuclear manufacturing facilities, in production chains. So a lot of different components can be attached to a PLC. But here they were looking for specific instructions and rotation speeds, which were again around 3 times the speed of sound. Because if you are connecting a different rotation system, not a centrifuge, but another system who is just like, let's say, in an assembly line, you have a rotation platform that is, for example, drilling a piece of wood. Maybe the rotation is just a couple of rounds or a couple of turns per second. Here we have extremely high speeds. So by doing those 4 checks on what is the operating system, am I connected to a Siemens machine? Do I see the right software? Do I see the right speeds? All of that gave them the understanding that yes, they were really in Natanz and they were really in the right place to infect. If those 4 conditions are met, then they deploy certain actions and they start misbehaving. And finally, you might wonder, how did they detect such an attack? Because again, it was so sophisticated that even the operators were not able to understand why certain centrifuges were breaking up so suddenly. So people were fired actually in Iran. They had investigations, they had people, auditors, specialists that were coming on site trying to understand whether or not they had been supplied with faulty mechanisms or um, faulty hardware, faulty components. So there were a lot of investigations in Iran to understand how was it possible that they were not reaching the enrichment threshold that they had fixed themselves. And they were kind of late on target. They had a lot of components that needed to be replaced. And these are not on the market components that you can find easily. It's very specific materials, and sometimes it can also take years or months in the deliveries. So they were really slowed down in their enrichment phases, but everything was discovered in June 2010 because the malware at some point there was a bug in it, which also show you that hackers, they are not perfect. They are great at developing complex programs that will infiltrate an offline plant. However, hackers, they also make mistakes, and in this bug, unfortunately, at some point the malware did not proceed to the four checks that I described and infected one of the working station of a subcontractor. But then the subcontractor went back at home and connected to a different system, and the malware again propagated and started infected online components in that company. So the malware kind of break out of the Natanz facility and started replicating itself across internet, eventually infecting thousands of machines around the world. And of course, when it's live on the world and replicating itself, people, they start to investigate, and many antivirus companies, many security companies started forensic investigations to understand, okay, what is this piece of software exactly doing? And by analyzing further, they understood that the malware was actually searching around the globe, searching for a nuclear plant to infect and perform some malicious actions. And that's how it was led to the discovery by the guys in Symantec and other researchers. And they produced a report. And of course, after that, they published some guidelines on how to detect and how to remove Stuxnet from the systems. Just a short focus on the version 2, because I think it's also interesting to understand. On the right, you have the Stuxnet infected removable drive. The idea is that either you use a USB device or you manage to, for example, send an email to a subcontractor. And the idea is that Stuxnet is going to deploy itself in the gray area. And so it's going to infect a certain number of servers, machines. And the idea is that in this company, for example, the subcontractor company, it's connected to internet. So Stuxnet, even though it's already deployed, you can update it. And so your command and control server can actually reach out to this company and send different orders or send additional packages, push an update to Stuxnet, just like any software. You can have updates even for malicious viruses. And after that, it's finally pushed into the white box, meaning the secure facilities. So it's really a different approach into the version 1, because version 1, you put the USB key and you cross your fingers and you pray that everything goes right as you programmed it. But in the version 2, you still have the opportunity of pushing updates to your malware and making changes to the code in order to further infect the industrial facilities. That's also to show you that the Stuxnet attack is not only about a single malware and just having a spy with a USB key. It's also about building and deploying a complete infrastructure to manage this malware. So the command and control servers push the updates, send some orders, send instructions, identify the right target. So it's really, again, almost organized crime in the sense that from the reconnaissance phase to the delivery and the execution, there is a lot of preparation, and every time it's extremely specific and adapted to the industrial systems that were installed and implemented in the facilities. Here, I'm going to go a bit more into the detail of the hack. As I said, in this version 2, the idea is that you can update some of the components of the malware. But in order for the systems to let you go and let you do that, because you are here infecting laptops within a company, there are some protection measures, there are some firewall. Basically, everybody needs at some point to update their computer. So by default, the company policies let you download a certain number of updates. And they let you do that because those updates are trusted. And the trust is there because another company, for example, a security company, has stamped this update as legitimate and trustworthy. So you need to understand that in order for Stuxnet to deploy a new update on certain of its components, they also needed to certify and sign their pieces of software as being legitimate and trustworthy. And to do that, the hackers of Stuxnet, they managed to hack and to breach into two different companies. They stole the certificates, they applied it to their piece of component, sorry, to their malware component. So that's really to show you that Stuxnet is not only about a virus, it's not only about building the infrastructure to command and control and perform certain actions, give orders to the malware, but third, it's also about breaching other companies, sometimes even security companies, to steal the certificate and make sure that the malware is recognized as a trustworthy and reliable source, even though it was clearly not. So that's really to give you an idea and understanding of how complex it is. It's just not targeting Iran. It's to do that, they also had to breach a certain number of companies in order to carry on their attack. Fourth element, Stuxnet, in order to deploy itself, was actually using 6 vulnerabilities in a row, which is a significant and almost a huge amount that was never seen before. Out of those 6 vulnerabilities, 4 of them were never seen before. They are what we call zero-day vulnerability because there is no protection, there is no security patch, there is nothing you can do about it. They were not even released to the public. And sometimes we see hackers that are using those so-called zero-day vulnerability, but this is something that they really keep for themselves because first, it's hard to find them. But if you use too much of your zero-day vulnerability, if at some point your malware is discovered, the analysts they are going to find that you had this golden ticket and they are going to start patching elements, so you will lose your advantage. Which really is here to highlight that using 4 vulnerabilities in a row that were never seen before, I mean, it's almost completely out of proportion, even for attacking a nuclear plant. So that's the fourth element to show you how complex the attack was. And fifth element is that as soon as the malware was detected, so back here when we were in June 2010, of course, many people were sending emails to, for example, Siemens, say, hey, can you advise on how to deal with that? The hackers, they didn't sit still and wait for something to happen. They performed denial of services. So they sent a lot of fake emails, a lot of data flows to those email addresses to make sure that they were completely flooded and unable to respond. So even though the malware was discovered and all the companies started a remediation, they were still in the optic, in the tactics of impacting those companies and making sure that the recovery and the remediation would take as long as possible. So those really are the 5 elements that were deployed and used in this attack. So first, building a super sophisticated virus. Second, building the infrastructure around it. Using the certificates, meaning they had to breach other companies. Fourth, using 4 unknown vulnerabilities in a row, plus others in order to perform their actions. And fifth, disrupt the hotlines and the services to make sure that they could do as much damage as possible in the long term. And so the question you might have is, well, did it work? The answer, short answer is yes. At some point, they were, I mean, it's a sensitive topic. So the authorities in Iran, they kept it slightly hidden for a while. But in November, finally, so November 2010, even the president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, admitted that a cyber weapon hit Iran nuclear program. So he did not directly refer to Stuxnet because the name came a bit afterwards, but that was directly, let's say, an admission that they were impacted. Even for a while, as they were not sure what was the cause of the incident, they had to stop their enrichment facilities and the process overall. And I will leave the conclusion to the US General Michael Hayden, who is the former head of CIA and the former head of NSA, so quite a big career. and someone knowledgeable about cybersecurity, as you can imagine. What he really compared Stuxnet, which is a groundbreaking event in the history of cybersecurity, because it was one of the first time that it was weaponized and really targeting vital industry in a country, in this case, the Iran nuclear program. So it was one of those really changing moments for cybersecurity, and it was really opening the gates for an area of new cyber weapons. And he almost compared it to the atomic bombs that were dropped in the Second World War. And he said, I don't want to pretend it's the same effect. So, indeed, there were no casualties, thankfully. But in one sense, at least, it's August 1945. So, it's really giving you the same idea that we are right on the bridge of something potentially disastrous, but it's really a new era, a completely change of paradigm in the sense that now cyber is known by everybody to be that it can be used as a weapon, it can be weaponized by individuals, organized crime, even perhaps nation states, but that's for the next video. In the next video, we will discuss who was behind the Stuxnet events, because as I said, there were many components within Stuxnet. It's not only about crafting a malware. There were spies on the ground. There were diplomatic issues. So we will try to give you some of this perspective without spoiling too much in this video, but that's for the next one. And of course, we will focus on the aftermath. So everything that was done afterwards, what is kind of the Stuxnet legacy, but that will be a fourth video. I hope you enjoyed this one. I know it's a bit long. It took me a lot of time to prepare it because there were many sources that I wanted to make sure to digest properly before recording this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the third video on Stuxnet. See you soon.